All right. So welcome, everybody. I was telling Stephen before we got started that part of this is going to be just asking if people have questions that whether we're addressing them in the training today or in the next few weeks or not. If you have questions, let us know because we'll do our best to. I've kind of tried to structure this so that we leave some time at the end to do just kind of some general questions or questions specific to your own experiences. So. Those of you who have a little more time with Cornerstones, some of this is going to be reviewed today. Well, probably most of it's going to be reviewed today, but I never think it hurts to go over this stuff more than once because it's not the day-to-day stuff. It's things that we deal with on a daily basis, but that we don't necessarily think about on a daily basis. Maybe that's how I want to say it. So today we're starting with kind of just the overview of adult education. So we're going to talk a little bit about the organizational structure and the funding of adult ed, and then some national reporting system background information. And I've tried to kind of gear this towards our more part-time teachers, but for our full-time people, it's not going to, like I say, it's not going to hurt to have that review. So here's kind of our just very loose agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about acronyms from our field because it never hurts to review some of those main acronyms over and over again that we just throw around and don't really think about. We're going to talk about the federal oversight of our program, our state organizational structure, which has changed a little just recently, and then just some very kind of high-level overview of the national reporting system and performance. So. And then whatever else you all want to add in. So I'm just going to jump right in. Our field, like every other field, has its own share of acronyms. It has its jargon. And again, a lot of times we use these without thinking about it. I've tried to be mindful of it because when I first started at Cornerstones 25 years ago now, I started at the end of the fiscal year, and the first staff meeting I sat in, they were talking about performance measures and they were throwing around all the acronyms that go with performance, and I had no idea what anybody was talking about. And I remember going home at the end of that first staff meeting day and telling my sister, I'm not sure I'm smart enough to do this job. Because it was like people were speaking a foreign language. So I've tried to not do that to people, but I know that we all do it without thinking. So I've got just 8 of the biggies on the screen for you here. AEL, Adult Education and Literacy, is just kind of the blanket term for the field of adult education nationwide now. That's the preferred term that the federal government has used for the last probably 10 or 15 years to just describe what it is that we do in the program that we work under. Anybody who hears John Anderson talk about our program will hear him refer to us as AFLA, which is Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, which is the actual federal legislation that identifies adult education as a federal program. So when John Anderson talks about AFLA programs or AFLA funded programs, he's talking about those of us who receive that federal funding that's passed down through the state for the programs that we run. ABE is Adult Basic Education, and that covers basic skills and GED preparation. ELA or ESL, the feds tried, and I like this change. I actually do, and I use this a lot, especially when I write about our program. The feds tried to move away from English second language, which has always kind of been a misnomer because so many of our non-native speakers speak multiple languages before learning English. So English is not their second language. It's often their third or their fourth. They tried to move to ELA for English language acquisition. It hasn't really stuck because ELA is, English language arts in the K-12 world. So people think it's confusing. But I really do think it's more descriptive of what our program is as an English language acquisition program for those non-native speakers. You'll also hear John Anderson and others of us talk about WIOA. That's the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Again, that's the name for the federal funding legislation that was passed in 2014. They always talk about reauthorization, which means there'd be another federal act and more funding legislation passed. It takes a long time for that to happen. So they'll talk about it and talk about it and talk about it. I was actually shocked that they got it done in 2014. We're under the third federal funding bill or act that I've experienced in my time. I started out under JTPA, the Job Training Performance Act. Then very shortly, about a year and a half after I started, we went to the workforce. What did the I stand for? It wasn't innovation. It was WIA, and then in 2014, we switched it to WIOA. So, yeah. And I've already forgotten what the I stood for under the former legislation. So they don't change very often. When they do, it generally it kind of upsets the apple cart on performance and those kinds of things. EFL is educational functioning level. Again, that's gains determined usually by assessment for us. And MSG, measurable skills gain, which is our primary performance measures, where the feds judge how well we're doing as a program. And all of that happens under the National Reporting System, or the NRS, which is the Federal Performance Guidelines. We're going to talk a lot about those last three a little bit later. Any questions or comments on any of those?
Becky, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I've taught over in the Middle East and a little bit in Europe, and they use EFL, English Foreign Language, or TEFL, and that's kind of confusing to me. But yeah. Maybe maybe they're not using that very much anymore. But
no, I've heard that before too, and yeah, so it can be very confusing. Yeah.
Becky, I was gonna say, you say LACES at every staff meeting, and I still have no clue what that is. Maybe that's just for us, but
LACES is in a lot of states in the US. It's the designation for the software that we use for data management. So LACES is actually, I know this one too. The Literacy, Adult, Community, and Education Systems. Yeah. And it's the shorthand, it's the acronym for the data management software through a company called Literacy Pro, which manages that software. So yeah, LACES is the program that I put all our stuff into, where all the reports come out of. So yeah, that's a good question, Comfort, and that is one of the main ones that I do kind of throw around. And yeah, I actually have to stop and think really hard what that does stand for, because it's one that has been around since I've used that for probably 24 of the 25 years I've been here, before our data management systems were almost non-existent. And when I used to have to do, the tables that we talk about sometimes, those tables at the end of the year, we run them every month, but at the end of the year is when they really count. We used to have to hand do those. I actually hand tabulated those tables for the first couple of years that I worked at Cornerstones, which was not a lot of fun. So we love the computer program instead.
Quick question, Becky.
Yeah.
So maybe this is just me that has sometimes been confused by this, but on our intake form, where it lists adult secondary education, adult basic education, for GED, should we just be checking ABE, or on those, what are you looking for?
Yeah, that designation, and it's hard on the intake form because you don't really know yet. That designation is actually between, ABE is technically anybody with assessed skills below a 9th grade level. An ASE is anybody with assessed skills above a 9th grade level. So you generally don't know that when you're filling out the intake. I always tell people to default to ABE because we have hardly anybody who tests in at an ASE level. And if they do, I make that adjustment after the assessment. So
okay, that helps. Thank you so much.
You are very welcome. Yeah, there's some of those things that are they're more confusing than they have to be. So hopefully we can clear a few of them up. So just in brief, Adult Education and Literacy, or AEL, is a program that's designed to teach eligible people in our state, 18 years of age or older, to read and write English and acquire basic skills necessary to function in society, to become more employable, productive, and responsible citizens, as well as allowing them to continue their education to at least the completion of secondary school. That is like the kind of overarching definition, right? At the federal level. And it's supposed to help students obtain reading, writing, math skills needed to get or keep a job, get those academic skills to help their children in school, help people prepare to take and pass the general education development or GED tests, and gain needed life skills such as completing job applications, completing resumes, budgeting, those kinds of things. So at the federal level, that's our directive. Questions about that? That one's a little more straightforward than the acronyms. We all know what we do. So here's kind of just a chart that shows our federal oversight and then our state organizational structure. So the federal government, under that Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, provides states funding for adult education and literacy programs. So the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Vocational and Adult Education, Division of Adult Education and Literacy, right? This poor woman has to do this every time she does her title. The director is now Latoya Newson. She's fairly new to that job within the last year or so. She's the appointee. We call that office for shorthand OCTAE, Office of Career, Technical and Adult Education. I usually just refer to them as the feds, so it's easier to remember. So the funding comes from U.S. Department of Education through the federal government. That funding is then granted to states, and states have the opportunity to decide how they run those pass-through dollars. In South Dakota, those dollars come through the Department of Labor, which seems odd, right? People wonder why it's not through education. It actually switched to Department of Labor about 24 years ago. And it makes a lot of sense to me in a lot of ways, because really adult education is an economic development issue. We're trying to help adults gain those skills to get into the workforce at higher skill level positions that will be higher paying positions that will help the economic development of our communities. So it makes sense to me that we're under that Department of Labor at the state level. There are several other states that run through Department of Labor. Some states at the state level will also run through Department of Education. Some states are through the regential system. They'll be in community colleges through the Board of Regents in their states. So that's kind of how it works there. So our state Secretary of Labor and Regulation is Marsha Holtman at this point. And then this is actually already a little outdated. I haven't redone my little chart, but Barb Unruh actually just left Department of Labor as a program specialist. John Anderson is our program specialist who's in charge of adult education at the state level. And he's really the only one at this point and at the state level who's working under adult education and literacy. Okay. Then you see it goes down to local program directors, coordinators, classroom instructors, volunteers. At the local level, programs look very different, right? And anybody who's Aubrey just got back from a trip to Sioux Falls, and she got to sit in on some classes at Lutheran Social Services and at Southeast Technical Institute. She got to visit a couple other programs. The programs can look very different. Just based on their demographics of their students, the makeup of their staff, their focus in classes. Lutheran Social Services and Cornerstones are the two largest providers of English language instruction in the state. So programs who don't have a large number of English language learners are going to look very different from our program. They're going to be far more focused on GED. They're not going to have the large numbers of English language learners. We have some programs in the state who are adult education programs that do not receive those state and federal funds. Tribal examples are one of those programs. Tribal programs can run their own adult education programs through their tribal funding. So we have partners who come to some of our state level conferences and trainings who come from the tribal programs. They're kind of like our cousins in adult education rather than our brothers and sisters, if that helps, the way to think about it. But at the local program level, all providers are really working towards those same goals, building those basic academic skills of their participants. But, you know, just as the communities we serve are very different, those local programs are going to be different. And actually, under Cornerstone's umbrella, from Aberdeen, Huron, Mitchell, Yankton, Vermilion, and now Pierre joining our little umbrella, each community is very different demographically, and when we're working out in the community, there are much different philosophies and approaches to adult education between all of Cornerstone's locations as well. So there are now 6 state-funded adult education programs in South Dakota. Cornerstone's just agreed to fold Pierre into our organization as well. We're still kind of figuring out how that's going to look, but it's not going to make any difference to our daily operations in terms of classes. You just might see some students from different locations coming into your classes at some point. We don't think there's going to be large numbers. Pierre last year served 42 students. So it's not going to be a big dent in our program. Yeah, any questions about that? No. Okay, then let's talk about performance. All federal funding is always tied to performance expectations, and the legislation, the WIOA, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, that legislation outlined the funding and performance expectations of programs all across the United States. There are several indicators that they use for our performance to show that we're being effective with the federal dollars that we're given. As much as we don't like thinking about performance as a taxpayer, I appreciate the fact that they're keeping track of how well we're doing with the money that people put in to our programs through their taxes. So the national reporting system is tracking those negotiated performance measures on those indicators. And there are a couple of different ways that you can show performance under this legislation. The first is measurable skills gains. So there are 2 ways for South Dakota's adult ed students to achieve a measurable skills gain. They can either complete an educational functioning level, those EFLs, or they can complete a secondary diploma or credential. Okay, that's their high school equivalency, completing the GED, right? That's pretty straightforward. When somebody completes their GED, we know they've done it. Measurable skills gain is a little bit foggier. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Those educational educational functioning levels. Those educational functioning levels, there are 3 different ways you can achieve an educational functioning level. You can compare pre-test to post-test using an approved test. The BEST test that you will hear people talk about is one of those tests for English language learners. The TABE test is the one that we use for our GED learners. And actually now there's a very new 3rd way, and that's by completing 1 GED subtest. The feds just changed this like literally 2 weeks ago and let us know that retroactive to the beginning of this year, anybody who completed a GED subtest also makes an educational functioning level gain. So that one's not on my chart yet. So pre-test to post-test gain is one way to show an educational functioning level. Another way is enrollment in post-secondary education and training after exit. This happens actually when students leave our program and enter a post-secondary program during that same year. This one doesn't happen often, but we actually do have it happen. People might complete their GED early on in the year and then enter a post-secondary program in the second part of the year. Or our English language learners also will sometimes come to us. They already have a degree in their home language, their home country. They need to build their English language skills so they're able to do the post-secondary level work. So they'll build those English language skills with us, they'll exit our program, and then they'll enroll in a post-secondary program. The third way, awarding of Carnegie units or credits in an adult high school program, doesn't pertain to anybody in South Dakota because none of our adult education programs are able to award those Carnegie units. The K-12 system doesn't approve that for us in South Dakota. So here's the NRS, or National Reporting System, performance for this past year. Every year we get these negotiated performance levels in the state assessment policy. These are negotiated between John Anderson at the state level and our federal government representative for our region. So the levels that you see in the left-hand column are the educational functioning levels, or the EFLs. Each functioning level represents more than one grade level, and some EFLs represent a greater skill range. So if you look at the low intermediate ABE level, that's grade equivalents 4.0 to 5.9. So 4 and 5 essentially, but the high intermediate ABE level ranges from 6.0 to 8.9. So 3 grade levels. So to make an educational functioning level gain, you're actually jumping 2 to 3 grade equivalents in a year. The ESL ones are even crazier. The beginning ESL literacy level covers 273 points on the Best Plus assessment, and the ELA low beginning level only covers 65 points on the same assessment. How the feds figure these things, I do not know. It used to be, I want to say like 365 or 375 points in that first level. So they did make some corrections and made it a little bit easier to show a gain on that one, but it's still very disproportionate at those basic level skills. And Debbie actually can even tell us how many questions on the Best Plus that you have to answer in order to be able to pop yourself up out of those lowest skill range levels. It's not very many to get up into those kind of 200 points on the Best Plus. So when we talk about students demonstrating improvement through pre and post testing, we're talking about those educational functioning levels. Each EFL has its own negotiated performance level that represents the percentage of students who start the fiscal year at that assessed level and then are able to gain at least one educational functioning level by the end of the fiscal year. And again, our fiscal years run July 1 to June 30. So our performance and funding is based in part on our ability to help students improve at least one educational functioning level through the course of a program year. So for those of you who are more visual learners, right, here's a little chart for you. Measurable skill gains, either getting that secondary diploma or credential, that GED, or making an educational functioning level gain. And then the really 2 ways that people make an educational functioning level gain in South Dakota through pre and post testing, or program exit and entry into a post-secondary program. Questions about that?
I had one, but I forgot. So I'll keep.
When you think of it, let me know.
Okay.
Okay. So in order to count as a federally funded adult education participant who's tracked for these indicators, a student has to have a completed state intake form, an initial assessment, and at least 12 hours of instruction. Until they hit that 12 hours of instruction mark, they're not technically a participant in our program. It's what we would call like a fundable participant under the federal regulations. So let's talk a little bit about getting there, right? One of the first activities we generally complete with new students is a student intake form. Those of you who are very part-time, like Stephen and Comfort, you don't generally do those intake forms, right?
Right.
Those forms are developed by the state staff to facilitate the collection of data for entry into that LACES program, the data management system. All that information that you collect from students is entered into that data management system, and the system tracks student enrollment and progress and produces the reports that show our programs and our state's progress in meeting those performance indicators that we just talked about. So I'm not going to go over the intake form in great detail with you because most of you don't have to do that. And the ones of you who do, I think, are pretty comfortable with it by now. But I do think it's important for everybody to kind of be aware of the kind of information we capture and why we're gathering that information. So first of all, we're required to provide certain demographic information to the state and federal funders of our program. Much of that is to identify trends in student population and progress, and really to ensure that we're serving those people most in need. If we were running an adult education program that only ever served Caucasian people 30 years and older who had high level skills coming into our program, things would be called into question, right? Because the federal government can look at our census data and see that there are more people in our communities than that slice of the population that would be in need of our services, who we could be serving. And our directive is always to serve the students who are most in need. So, you know, things like racial and ethnic background, age, gender, the student's entry level is one of the things that we're required to track, and that they look at that. There's actually a percentage that we have to have. 75% of our students need to be assessed at intake as coming in under that 9th grade skill level. We never have a problem meeting that directive. We also document additional demographic information that helps us in writing other grants from other funders like the United Way in all of our communities, and information that can inform our decisions as a program. So that information includes things like the languages spoken by our students, the businesses that employ a large percentage of our students. We actually ask, you know, not just are you employed or unemployed or not in the labor force, which is a federal piece of information we're required to gather, but we also ask if they're working, where they're working, because that can sometimes impact our class schedules. I know there's an example from Aberdeen a few years ago. All of a sudden, our evening classes were we had almost zero participation in Aberdeen, and we couldn't figure out why. Well, it turned out that one of the major employers, which is the Demkota beef plant at that time, was doing mandatory overtime, and students were doing mandatory overtime and not able to come to class in the evening because they were still at work. You know, knowing that this large percentage of students that all of a sudden dropped off the map were employed at that one place helped us track that down and figure out, oh no, they didn't just leave our program. They didn't just ditch us. They're at work, and we can understand that and we can accept that, right? The student demographic data is all captured at the time of intake, which means we document the things that are true for those students on the day that they enroll in our program. But as we all know, those things change and need to be updated. So if in class one of your students says, oh, teacher, I moved, my address is different, or my phone number is different, my email is different. Some of our students change their emails like we all change our socks, right? I mean, it seems like every other week somebody's got a new email address, or that they got a job or they changed jobs, and maybe that's going to make their schedule change. Or if you have a student who came to us and had not received their social security number when they enrolled with us, and then they subsequently got their social security number because all their paperwork came through, they might say, oh, teacher, I have my social security number. Any of that information that students tell you is new or has changed, please document it and then contact me, because I update that all in the LACES system, in the data management system, so that we've got the most up-to-date information on our students as possible. So when they share that kind of information with you, generally you can just send me an email and let me know, you know, so-and-so told me their phone number changed, here's their new phone number. The one thing that I don't want you to email me with is a social security number, because we want to be a little more secure than just email with those. So if somebody gives you their social security number, number one, please don't encourage them to do that just aloud in class in front of everybody. Some of our students really have a hard time understanding like the importance of that number and the confidentiality of it. And anybody who's ever done an intake with a student who's an immigrant or a refugee, and they've just like kind of dumped their bag of stuff out on the desk in front of you and given you like their birth certificate, their driver's license, their passport, and their immigration papers, it's horrifying. It always just makes me want to like gather everything up and lock it up for them. But do try and keep those as secure as you can. If somebody gives you their social security number, just give me a call and we'll talk about the best way to give that to me. So questions about any of that? Debbie was smiling when I talked about the dumping the bag. She's had it happen before too.
Oh, a few times, and it's usually a time for a life lesson.
Yes.
I usually say, well, I'm so glad you have all this information, but you
Yeah.
shouldn't carry it around with you. Especially one day lady dumped it all on my table, and she had walked there, you know, with it. So she's walking around town with a backpack full of all these things that should be locked in a safe somewhere. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I've actually had, I've had, I tend to call them homegrown students, right? Like are born and grew up in the United States right here in South Dakota. A lot of students who, when I ask them for their social security number, will pull their social security card out of their wallet, and I'll tell them, you know, you shouldn't have that in there. That should be at home locked up someplace. And they have no idea why. So we do a little life lesson there too. So once everybody completes that intake paperwork, and they've done their assessment, they're actually officially part of our program, right? Their program entry starts on the date they complete that intake paperwork. So program entry is pretty simple. Program exit gets fuzzier, right? We know students exit our program at any time for many reasons. Sometimes they know they've exited, sometimes they don't. Stephen and I were just talking about that. You know, like sometimes I'll have them on my list and they won't show up, and then all of a sudden they'll come back. Like they'll leave for a while, they'll come back. They won't show up for 2 months, and all of a sudden they'll be in class. Officially, program exit occurs when the participant has not received services. And in layman's terms for our program, not receiving services means they haven't attended classes or studied on Burlington English or GED Academy for at least 90 days. And they have no additional services scheduled. So then the date of their exit is the last date on which they received services, or in our case, the last date they logged any study hours with that, whether that was in class or through Burlington English app or through GED Academy online. Now, we can't officially determine that exit date until that 90 days has elapsed. So it's almost always retroactive, right? Every month I go through and I get a report in the data management system that tells me these students have gone 90 days without any hours. And then I go through and I do officially exit them. But they're in limbo for 3 months until that officially happens. So let's talk a little bit about that phrase that's in red on the screen, has no additional services scheduled. That means the student has not told us that they'll be returning. So we have this happen quite often too. Students tell us they're going to have a prolonged absence from our program. Sometimes new moms who are going to have their babies, they'll say, teacher, I'm not going to be back. I need some time with my baby, right? That's totally understandable. It's a big adjustment when you bring a new life home. Maybe they're starting a new job and they need some time to adjust. Often our students who are immigrants or refugees will be traveling out of the country for an extended visit to their family. If I'm buying a plane ticket to Burma, I'm not going to be there for a week, right? It's going to be a longer time. So when that happens, if a student tells you those things, I can go into the data management system and I can enter the date that they plan to return to classes. And then if it's going to be more than 90 days, if they have a service scheduled with us, which means I'm going to come back to class in November, they won't exit the program. They'll stay enrolled until that date when they told us they were going to come back. So why is this important? Because every program entry is counted as a period of participation, or a POP, even if it occurs during the same program year. So if a student has more than one program entry, they're going to have multiple periods of participation in the year, and technically, that means they count as 2 people for the year. So again, why does this matter? It helps me to think about it this way. We have somebody who comes into our program in July. They come to class regularly, they get more than 12 contact hours, so they have a period of participation. They stay in classes until October, and then they stop coming to class. And 90 days go by, so they're officially exited from our program. Then in March, they come back. We update their paperwork, they start coming to class again. We're happy they're back, right? We want them to come in and continue to work on their goals. They get 12 contact hours again. Their second period of participation begins. They stay with us until the program year ends in June. And at this point, this one student would count as 2 people on our reports for the year. So I'll ask again, does that matter? And the answer is maybe. So if the student accumulates enough hours to take a post-test before they leave in October and they make a gain, we would be at 100% performance for that one student, right? That's great. If they post-test again in June and make another gain, we would still be at 100% performance, and that's amazing. But if when they take a post-test in either October or in June, they don't make a gain, we'd be at 50% performance, which is not as good. And if they don't make gains in either of their periods of performance, we would be at 0% for 2 people, which is even worse. So my message to you here is, whenever a student tells you they need to be gone from class for a period of time, be sure to ask if they know when they're planning to return. And if it's anywhere close to that 90-day mark, just let me know. Again, it can just be an email. So-and-so is going to be gone for this reason. They're coming back on this date. I usually add a 2-week cushion to the date that they give us, right? Because who knows? And I'll put that scheduled return date in the system, and we can avoid having that second period of participation for the year. Questions about that? All right. I'm done yammering at you. So now it's your questions. What do you got for me?
Is it me when I call them, like I have a person that popped 3 times in 1 year, I say, she's 3 negative people. Because she gets like, just barely enough hours each time and then never makes a gain. Yeah.
Yeah, you tend to start to think that way, and it's sad, right? But yeah. 3 is extreme. We hardly ever have any that are 3. Every once in a while. We don't have that many that are 2, honestly. I think we maybe had 4 extra periods of participation this year, which is, I mean, when you consider that we had 500 some people that counted, that's pretty amazing. So we do
I
pretty
think we
well.
were better this year in Yankton
Mhm.
anyway. I think I had less. I always have some repeat offenders. When I said she was a 3 negative people, that was probably over a span of 2 years, but
Right.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do have a
Becky,
question. Stephen, go
sorry.
first.
Go ahead. No, Deb, go ahead.
My question I should have asked earlier, but I wasn't fast enough on my mute button. When we were talking about peer, I wanted to know, when we register a Vermilion person, even though Yankton takes care of them, we're registering them as a separate site as Vermilion. Are we going to be registering peer as a separate site like Vermilion? You're
Yeah.
nodding. Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't know if someone was going to absorb those like Mitchell does Salem, or you know what I mean.
Kim and I, that's a good question. And Kim and I talked about that, and we kind of were of 2 minds of it, but we decided we wanted to be able to pull that out just for the purposes of our own knowledge, right? So if you look at the new timesheets, and maybe none of you have it on you showing on yours yet, but some of us have peer as categories on the timesheet. So we will be actually like recording time that we spend working on things for peer and with peer students as peer. And yeah, as they come in, I'll have to designate them as peer in LACES as well. So I'll kind of keep them separate just for, I mean, because for one thing, we want to see what they do to our numbers, right? And we want to know kind of how they're splitting out. And it's
Okay, I
mean,
just
it's
opened it and I see the PI, right?
Yep,
PIAEL. So all the stuff that I did for the scheduling of the peer students, I'll need to change my
Put in-
hours.
put in peer. Yep,
Okay.
put into peer. Yep. Stephen, what was your question?
Or just the, what we were discussing earlier, Becky, that one student, should you mention names on this, on Zoom here? I imagine not, huh?
No, you can. I mean, it's just us. We're never going to make the recording of this publicly available. This will be available
Okay.
by link just to our
Well,
own
there,
staff.
there was that student Tony, and his middle name was Orlando, and I had another Tony in the class, so I always put Tony, Orlando, and Dawn in parentheses, so I could disseminate between them. And it only until you and Debbie got involved did I figure out where this guy came from, and he was zooming in and out, and he ended up to be one of my best students. He was ultimately put up to the next class and stuff. But how active should you be? How proactive should you be in trying to connect with the students every week, like on email? And it just sometimes it's, you know.
I think if you've got those students who like they're in and out like that, it never hurts to just let them know when you notice that they're not there, I think. And certainly if you've got somebody who's been coming in kind of regularly and then they sort of drop off, I would definitely be contacting them. And that actually brings up another good point. I'm gonna stop sharing this screen and switch to my other screen. If you're wondering where to find the contact information, and I think this is something that can be kind of confusing, it's always a month behind because you can find it in a couple different ways. But if you look at reports, and then I didn't share, I just flipped to my screen where I know it is. That doesn't help you guys at all. So there we go. Now I'm sharing my screen. Are you seeing my drive? Yes, okay, good. So in Google Drive, I'm going to back up a level here. In this folder called LACES Reports and NRS Tables, you all should have access to this. This is kind of the catch-all for everything adult education, right? I'm going to go into the fiscal year 24, which is the year we just finished here, just to show you. Every month has its own folder. I'm going to go into the June 2024 folder, and every month at the end of the month, technically the beginning of the next month, I go in and I pull these same reports. And one of the things I pull is everybody's class list at the end of the month. So for the end of June 2024, these were the class lists. And I'm just going to open up the ESL ones, and I'll go to Stevens, which was kind of crazy making. Because it was a little out of control everywhere in ESL last year. This is a place where you can find the cumulative list of your students who've been enrolled in your class for the year, right? So these are the students who were in basic evening 0.5 with Stephen. You've got their names, you've got their status, you've got their current level and their current fiscal years, fiscal year hours. You've got what site they're based out of. That doesn't necessarily mean that's where they live, but like Jose Antonio Aguirre was based out of Yankton. If we go down here though, you'll see his address was Aberdeen. I don't know how that happened. It's possible I made a mistake.
I was going to say, how did that happen?
I
Because
don't know.
usually, even if I enroll an Aberdeen student, I still write Aberdeen.
It's also possible he moved. And that's
Oh,
something that could have
sometimes
happened
that
too.
happens. Yeah.
Sometimes that happens too. And then I don't always change the site because I don't necessarily notice it. I'll change the address, but I don't necessarily change the site. You can see the date that that student completed intake, the date they last enrolled, which generally will be the same, but sometimes not. Like here, we had a student who their intake date was a couple weeks earlier than their enrollment date. They might have just taken some time to decide what class, or they might have added a second class after the fact. And then you'll get their contact preference. How do they prefer to be contacted? So text, email, phone is like the least popular one these days. Usually our students want to either receive a text or an email. And then you'll have their phone number and their email address. You'll have their physical address. So if you're looking for a way to contact your student, like I say, it's always going to be back end. It's always going to be the end of the month before that you'll look for this. The other thing you can do, if you're not sure you have the contact information for a student and you can't find it on your last class list, you can always email me and just say, I'm trying to contact this student. Can you please give me their contact information? And I will happily do that for you. This is also a place where you can go in and record their social security number. And again, these are closed. They're not open to anybody who's outside our organization. So you can record a social security number here and then just send me an email and tell me, so-and-so gave me their social security number. I added it on my class list. And then I'll know. And I can go there and grab it. So the class lists are a good place to look for that contact information. And just to see like who's still active. Comfort is awesome at this. She will every month when she goes through the reports, when the reports go into the folder, she'll go in and she'll say, so-and-so has been coming, they're not on the list yet. A lot of times that's just because I haven't gotten to them yet. But I like having her notice that like, I've got this student who's not on my list yet. And so it's, you know, it's a good cross check of me, which is, I always need that because I make mistakes too. I mess things up. And she'll also tell me, I've never seen this student, right? They're still on my list. I've never seen them. They can probably come off. Usually as soon as I take them off, they'll make contact again and then we just put them back on, which is also easy, right? It's a simple thing to do. So she looks at her attendance sheet and her class list and she gives me that feedback on a pretty regular basis. Sometimes she doesn't have any for me in a month and then I feel pretty good about myself. But that's really helpful because the reason those reports are in there is because we want everybody to have access to them and use them for, you know, for whatever you need them for. But then also if something doesn't look right, by all means, tell me. And yeah, sometimes like Stephen talked about the student with the, you know, the kind of multiple names, that happens more often than we like to think, right? And sometimes it's because they just go by a totally different name. We have a young Karen woman whose name, she goes by Esther, and I totally can't tell you what her Karen name is. And it's confusing to me every time until it clicks for me, oh, that's Esther. Because it's not her legal name that she's enrolled under, but it's the name she goes by.
Regarding Jose, he must have been in Yankton initially, but he's at the beef plant right now, so
Yeah,
he
he's
must
at
have
the
moved
beef
to
plant
Abilene.
now. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but and then another question I had, sometimes we get a lot of times we get these emails saying adding or dropping classes. And when you look at the email, you can't disseminate if it's an add or a drop. Some people will kind of make a note at the bottom to clarify it, but otherwise you just don't know if it's adding or dropping, whether it matters, I guess, until it shows up on your list. But
I'm just going to go in. I'm going to make sure that yeah, I'm glad you asked me about that earlier, Stephen, because I thought I need to make sure that this is, and it should be shared with everybody because it's shared in the folder. This is the one for fiscal year 25 that I'm going to show you. So the same thing, LACES reports and NRS tables, fiscal year 25, which is the year we're now in. And this class add drop list is not in any month, right? You'll see a whole bunch of stuff in here that isn't month specific. Like there's the master class schedule, the Zoom links for the students and teachers, the class calendar. And then this is the class add drop list. And this is all generated off a form that we all fill out either when we do the intake form or when a student tells us that they want to switch a class, or if they gain a level on their assessment, we think they need to move up a class. So you should be able to go in and look at this sheet whenever you get one of those emails, and I think it will probably help, because here it tells you, you've got the date that it happened, the staff person who did it, the student's first and last name, the effective date of the change, and then, oh, I'm gonna freeze those, sorry. Just because eventually it's gonna bug me. It already does. So you'll see the effective date that it's going to start, and then it tells you in this column, this is a class they're adding, this is a class they're dropping. And then I go in, and when I actually enter those changes in LACES, I put the date that I entered them into the system. And then there's a space for comments too. So if there are any comments that the teacher has made or that the staff person has made when they did that, they can make those comments will show up there, or you can actually add comments to it as well. So do you think that'll help, Stephen?
That's very helpful. I apologize. I wasn't aware of those lists, I guess.
No. That's why we're doing these trainings.
The other
Those
thing
things get missed.
The other thing that's going to help is Nikita changed it. Last year, it was really hard to tell if they were adding or dropping. It just said the class changed. But I believe now it says adding, and then it lists the class adding, and it's like just a stock form. So it'll say adding in any class they're adding, but it could be blank. Dropping in any class they're dropping, but it could be blank. And then it says non-Zoom classes, like for the couple of face-to-face classes. And so all three categories are like listed on there, and only the ones that apply will be filled. So check that out in the next one you get, Stephen, see if it looks better than it did last year, because she tried to make it easier.
You bet, Debbie. Thank you.
Right. And like this one, here's one that applies to you in 2 ways, Stephen. So that Karen went in and said that Luis is he's adding basic evening with you, but he's dropping basic afternoon with you. So that's one. When I go in and make the change, I'll make sure that that's reflected on the attendance sheets and on the data management system, and eventually on the class lists too. So it'll all show up hopefully correctly. But this is another good place to, to kind of cross-check me, because if there's the way we're doing it now has helped me so much with the adds and drops. Because before I would just have like kind of an endless string of emails of people just telling me so-and-so is adding this class and dropping this class. And I'd have to save those emails and try and go through them all. This is far more organized and easy to use, I think, for everybody. So it's been a pretty effective system. And yeah, Nikita put that together for us.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I kind of remembered the gist of mine, back to testing and gains, measurable skill gains. When we talk about pre and post test, when we have a new client or student come in, they take a TABE or a BEST, that's a pre-test.
Yes.
Is the post-test considered what's at the end of the year or after that 60 hours?
Either. Yeah. Whenever they assess on that same instrument again, that's considered the post test. So yeah, there's that minimum number of hours that they're supposed to get. Right now it's 40 for TABE tests and 60 for BEST tests. When we get the new BEST tests going, it'll be 40 for the BEST test as well, which will be awesome. We're going to talk more about assessment tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow. I had to stop and think about what order I had things in. So yeah, that's a good question, and we'll get a little more in depth on that tomorrow.
Okay, cool.
And any other questions that you think of when we're done, even if they're not gonna, even if they apply to what we talked about today, by all means, jot them down and make sure to bring them up, because like I said, I kind of wanted to save a good chunk of time from each one of these to just answer your questions. And I know when Debbie does her part, that's going to focus a lot on Burlington English, she's going to, I think, just kind of walk you through, and wherever you're going to have questions, you're going to ask your questions about where everything is in Burlington, correct? Yeah.
Another question on assessment. I noticed in the new class, several of my students that were in my previous class were moved up. Dale Smani, Elizabeth, Tony Orlando guy, And I was kind of disappointed because they're wonderful students. They're just great to work with, but it had that check there moved up.
Yeah.
So I just presume they must have taken the test again and moved up.
Yep, yep.
Not, okay.
And now some of that, I'm gonna qualify that. Some of that may change because Debbie's actually, she's doing a wonderful thing for me, and she's kind of going through those class lists right now and looking at the scale scores on the best and seeing if we need to kind of recalibrate across those basic level classes in the evening. So there's still a little shifting that's happening there. Some of those class lists might change a little bit, but we're gonna have them worked out in the next couple of weeks so that we know for sure who's starting where at the beginning of August.
And to be honest, I think I just felt that Tony and Elizabeth and Dale Smani were above the basic level.
Yeah.
They were always very interactive and they could handle pretty much everything. So
Yeah.
I just wondered if they were perhaps choosing to be in the basic level or something, but anyhow.
No, I think that what happened is they probably, they advanced a little faster than some of the other students in the class. The other thing that happens at that lowest level of basic is sometimes you'll have students who they'll advance a little faster, and then you're always kind of adding the new lower level students.
Yeah.
The other thing we try and do at the end of each year is move up anybody who is in that situation, Stephen, that you just described, because you're going to go back to the beginning of the basic level curriculum now in August. And that'll be far, far too easy for those students who are having an easier time at the end of the curriculum. So.
And I did that already. Debbie suggested I start over because I think I was moving a little fast and I got through it. And so I kind of moved back and started. And I have Angela with me, who's just wonderful because she can kind of do some of the Spanish back up a little bit. So she's just been wonderful. But I'm sorry, I'm the slow person in the room, but I'm just kind of learning everything. I told Becky that I worked for a couple organizations that were very strict, and you didn't dare make a mistake. Put a period where a comma should have been, otherwise they would come and track you down and kill you. So I just appreciate the open-mindedness of this organization, and I realize our clientele is, you have to be pretty resilient and helpful to them and stuff like that. So I really enjoy this, but I just, that's kind of why I'm maybe a little bit,
I told Stephen that we know that the best way to learn is making mistakes, and we're never sad when people make mistakes as long as we're able to help them correct them. And as I always say, you cannot ask too many questions for me. Questions are the way we all learn too. And sometimes I don't have the answers, and that's always great because it just means that we've got something new to figure out, and we're working on something that we can collaborate on then. So never worry. And Stephen, you've got far less experience than the other people in this meeting right now. So don't worry about having questions. It's perfectly natural. So
I appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will let you all go then for today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same link, and talking about assessments a little bit more in depth. So I look forward to that.
See you guys. Thank you, Becky.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.